Jesus way,
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way,
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.
The Church of the Brethren is on the move to assist people in many places in this world. Today, there are some brethren who feel it is an international church. We see the Church of the Brethren assisting people in Nigeria, Haiti, Brazil, as well as in the Dominican Republic and many other places in the world. Historically, the Brethren become involved when called to meet a need. We assist others who have identified problems and there is a need for assistance. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. We can also include South Sudan in that list of countries. And John Jones of Myrtle Creek, Oregon, has just returned from a visit to South Sudan with a group of brethren. John, it's wonderful to have you with us on Brethren Voices.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you very much.
I want to begin by kind of asking you, where is South Sudan?
Yeah.
And why is it important to us?
South Sudan is in the Horn of Africa, in the eastern part of northern Africa. And then just due west of Ethiopia is South Sudan. It's the newest country in the world. It got its independence in 2011 officially with a referendum by the people of South Sudan. And then to the north of South Sudan is Sudan, or the Republic of Sudan, which South Sudan was part of for many, many years. And to the south is Uganda. To the southeast slightly is Kenya. To the southwest is the Republic of the Congo. And then just due west of South Sudan on the western edge is Central African Republic.
I first heard of South Sudan when I was in Egypt, and I saw a lot of camel trucks heading north. And I said, well, what are those? Where are they coming from? And they said, they're coming from the Sudan, which is where the camels are coming from that are going to auction in Cairo. And there's a Cairo auction for camels every day. I was absolutely amazed. But it's also the place where the Nile comes. The blue Nile comes from Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. The white Nile comes through Sudan.
Well, the Western Nile flows out of Uganda up into South Sudan at Nimile. Nimale's a border town, and that's the main border crossing right in that part of the Ugandan, South Sudanese border area. But as it flows north, it goes up into the Upper Nile region, which is the eastern and northern part of South Sudan, and that is where the Sud is. The Sud is like a more of wetlands. It's kind of a Nile basin type area. Historically speaking, very valuable because it's a great water source. And then a little further north, right along that border, kind of the central and eastern northern border between the south and the north, the current South Sudan, Republic of South Sudan, and the current Republic of Sudan, is an oil-rich area. There's a lot of oil there, and some of the political juxtapositioning over the more recent years of South Sudan's history have been because that oil is there, and who controls that oil is critical in terms of international power and wealth and what have you.
John, you actually have been to the Sudan twice, in 1993 and 2015. We'd like to know why you went in the first place, and then why did you go back again in 2015?
Well, I'm a member of the Church of the Brethren here in Oregon, and I was asked back in 1993 to consider going on a fact-finding trip to South Sudan because the Brethren had had connections there for a number of years. In the early part of the 20th century, the south part of Sudan, the southern portion of Sudan, was administered by the British. The northern portion of the Sudan was administered by Egypt. To this day, the northern portion of Sudan has more Arab cultural aspects to it, different racial makeup even, The South is much more what we call a black African kind of racial makeup and definitely cultural makeup, much more like Kenya and Uganda. And a great deal of conflict over the history of the 20th century in Sudan has been because of those kinds of divisions. People often say religious. It's not always religious. There's cultural, religious factors that go into socioeconomic aspects of a world situation where there is conflict, and oftentimes it's these socioeconomic complexities that add to the conflict. In Northern Ireland, I lived there back in the early 1970s, and a lot of Northern Ireland people would say, oh, it's Catholics and Protestants. Well, of course, it isn't that simple, and a place like South Sudan is certainly not either. But the racial and socioeconomic considerations are something we have to look at. It's not just a simple question of, oh, these people have always fought and they're always going to fight, and why are you bothering with that? Mm-hmm. In the early 80s, the Schrocks, Roger Schrock and Carolyn Schrock, who are Church of the Brethren members, were asked to go into kind of the northeastern portion of the Sudan and work on an agricultural project because they had had experience in India with successfully implementing various agricultural programs. And they were involved then there. And it was about that time that the war in South Sudan got reignited. There had been, for our intents and purposes today, the war in Sudan between the government of Khartoum and the Sudan People's Liberation Army dates back to about 1955. In 72, there were peace talks in Addis Ababa, and there was a very tenuous peace between 1972 and 83. In 83, things heated up again, and the war started getting going in earnest. That was about the time that Carolyn and Roger were first there, and they had to leave Sudan for a period of a few years. And then later they came back in the 90s, in the very early 90s, and that was the period when I was there in 93. And Roger and Carolyn and a couple who were very dear in the hearts of many brethren, Phil and Louis Raymond, who have died unfortunately several years ago in an automobile accident here in the United States, were very actively involved at that time in the south of Sudan. And the church there, the Christian church in the southern portion of South Sudan, had been in a situation where they couldn't communicate easily with the Council of Churches, which was centered in Khartoum, because of the war, the division, and many of the government leaders at that time considered anybody that lived in the south to be a rebel, which was not at all true of the Sudanese Christians there in the south, in the Council of Churches, but they were divided from their brothers and sisters in the north, so they decided to form a new Sudan Council of Churches, which would be a separate Council of Churches that could do work in the south, and Roger was asked to come and help organize that. So he went back in the 90s, and that's during the period when I was asked by Phil and Louis and Roger and Carolyn and people of the then called New Sudan Council of Churches to come and see. And I was with a group of 12 brethren here from the United States who went over there to observe and then to come back and advocate on behalf of the people of South Sudan. And there was great suffering then, many displaced people, many starving children. It was heartrending to be there and to see the situation of the people. And I went because I was asked to go. And this time it was similar. I'm answering your question about why I went. This time it had been 22 years. That boggles my mind. It had been that long. And it seems like only yesterday to me that I was there. But the real reason is because I had a relationship. And when Roger first asked me about a year and a half ago if I might consider going back, that he was considering bringing some people there to revisit and some new people who had not been there before, I told him that I just had a heart condition. I wasn't sure I'd be physically fit, but that I would love to go back. And I had a fear that if I went back, I'd get all involved again. And I'd just gotten retired. I didn't know if I wanted to go get all involved again. But but it was a come and see. And I really felt called to come and see. And I thought, here's these people, brothers and sisters, working for peace and risking their lives in South Sudan for peace. And I couldn't turn away.
The report is that you were actually very encouraged by your visit. And,
Yes.
And there's some really good things happening. Let's talk about those good things.
Yeah. When I came back in 1993, it was about a year after I was back, and I said to my wife, you know, Margaret, I think I'm depressed. And I had been talking in churches, gone back to Washington, D.C., and we'd actually had a meeting with Hillary Clinton's chief of staff. We were supposed to meet with Hillary Clinton, but it didn't work out. Her father died that weekend, and we were instead meeting with her chief of staff in her office. We met with Pentagon officials and United States USAID people there in D.C. and State Department people in D.C. And I had really tried to tell the story of people of South Sudan, but I had this kind of survivor's guilt thing, you know, that the suffering was so intense. My wife said to me, well, are you just figuring that out now? You know, you've been depressed for a year. The cultural shock was intense in that sense, and I always have wanted to go back. This time it was wonderful to go back and to see some things that I thought really were peaceful developments. In the area that I was in, which is the state of Eastern Equatoria, I was in a place called Torit, which is east of Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan. In that portion of the country, since 2005, when there was a comprehensive peace accord between the Sudan People's Liberation Army and the government of Khartoum, until 2011, when the people of the South voted to be an independent country. That was a time of negotiation over that oil that's in the northern border and what's going to be done with that and who's going to have control, and those kind of things were being considered at that time. And since 2005, there's been relative peace compared to 1993 in the area where I was. And so I saw, first and foremost, when I first got into Sudan, the thing that really surprised me was that the rainy season had come a month and a half early. When I was there before, it was January. It was the peak of the dry season. It was very dusty and dry, and the roads were terrible, but they weren't drenched in rain. This time, the rain had come a month and a half early. I was very surprised to see huge potholes filled with water that would swallow a van like we were riding in. And everything was really getting green fast. Things were growing like crazy. My friend from Virginia, George Barnhart, told me, he says, the soil here is amazing. We don't have soil like this in Virginia. Wish I had this soil. So people were already growing things. And there were all these little groupings of payam, or township lots of land that people were living on in little traditional houses, tukels, and little huts with grass thatched roofs.
And they're kind of conical, aren't they?
Kind of conical roofs, and looked very peaceful to me in comparison to what I'd seen before. Instead of these feeding centers where thousands of children with distended bellies and hunger were, and people displaced by the war, here were people living a hard life, but they were working with long-handled hoes, hand-tilling soil, growing sorghum and other, grain sorghum and other types of plants. They had goats, they had cattle. I didn't see any goats or cattle before. Most had been killed, or people were hiding them away. I don't know for sure which was always the case, but I saw no goats or cattle when I was there in '93. This time there were goats wandering around, small children tending them often, children playing, people working, as I say, very hard. I don't want to underestimate the need in South Sudan. The United States Agency for International Development recently described South Sudan as the most food insecure country in the world. Maternal mortality rates there are 1 in 7.
This is the mother who's dying?
The mothers who die as a result of being
child.
pregnant, either in childbirth or as complications of being pregnant, not getting the care they need, whatever. 1 in 7.
That's unbelievable, really.
Yes, the infant mortality rate is the highest in the world. So I don't want to understate the need in South Sudan. But compared to 1993, I saw things that I thought were life. I thought of the astrophysicist Stephen Hawking when he says that where there is life, there is hope. And I saw hope. A man named Jerome Serur, who was the deputy governor of the state of Eastern Equatoria, who we met with, told me personally, I was interviewing him, my little recorder, and the others in our group were listening also. I asked him, what hopeful story can you tell me to share with people back home? And he used this example of small-scale sustainable agriculture. And I was impressed that a state authority would so sincerely speak about this, because it's the one thing that I noticed above all else that I thought was hopeful.
Well, it occurs to me that if you're running for your life in a war zone, you're not going to stay home to tend your crops.
Absolutely.
So things have to be more stable for them to be able
When
to do.
people are displaced by war, they can't raise children and raise food to feed those children and have goats and have cattle, and they just can't do it because they're displaced by the war. In '93, there was one place I saw, a place called Loa Mission, bombed out Catholic church. There was a Catholic priest wearing a rag of a T-shirt with all kinds of holes. The only thing that would associate him as a priest was CRS across the front, Catholic Relief Services, across the front of the T-shirt. Otherwise, you'd have had no idea he was anything Catholic. Young guy, amazing young man, who it was very clear that people loved dearly. And at this place, Loa Mission, in the midst of war, they were growing mangoes. And I thought to myself, if I was a displaced person in Sudan, this is where I'd go. I don't care what my religion, I don't care what my, cultural orientation. If I was displaced and my children were hungry, I'd be right here. And I saw other examples like that, including the Brethren Peace Center and other places near Torit where we were, and in some other places where we traveled.
Well, let's talk about the children. What are they doing for the children?
Well, one of the really hopeful things I saw also from 1993 was the number of healthy children. Many of the children I saw in '93 were in feeding centers and things. And there weren't very many schools. And this is a part of the world where oftentimes girl children were neglected in terms of education. The boy children were put first, And
Some places the girls don't get to go to school at all.
that's right. And now there were some schools. We visited a school in '93 where the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, kind of the political wing of the resistance movement of that day, had a school, and that school was girls and boys. But now I saw public schools and private schools, Catholic schools and things, church schools and different other schools, but also public schools where the children were working together, playing together, healthy, relatively healthy. Again, life is tough, but not a handout kind of society where I felt like sometimes aid can be very demeaning to people, the way it's given. And the aid that has been that is evident there, and United States Agency for International Development is one of the aid agencies that has operated in Sudan for many years, and other international agencies. The kind of effects I've seen are not demeaning. I saw a proud people. I saw people working very hard to help each other and to survive, but they had a dignity about them. And I saw children in the orphanage near the Brethren Peace Center who were helping prepare meals, helping to grow food. They had a really a wonderful orchard going. Those kinds of interactions between children I saw as a very hopeful sign. And the one main thing that threatens that kind of tenuous peace that I think I was observing, and good peace, was the fact that there is civil strife in the mostly northeastern area of South Sudan today. And the government of South Sudan is divided. There are resistance forces fighting against the current leadership of the country. And I think, my opinion is, most of it is about control of power, oil, those kinds of influences. But in areas where I saw this relative peace, that is threatened most certainly and most greatly by the possibility that this civil strife could grow into a more comprehensive civil war that could encompass the whole country, and that would be terrible for the people and for the children.
Well, I want to go back to something you alluded to in terms of proud people and not a handout. And it's some really sensitive issues between how we help people in this world. And do you have a perspective on that? Because obviously if people are starving, they would like to have food or they're going to die. But after they're fed, proud people don't always want what we think we should give them. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Lilla Watson, who is an Aboriginal activist from Australia, is one of my heroes. And one quote that she has, and I may paraphrase her here, but she says, "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you see that your liberation is tied with mine, that our struggle is one, then let us work together."
Wow.
And to me, that says everything about someone who wants to, quote, help. We need partnerships. First of all, we don't give people what we think they need. We give people what they need. And in some ways, relief work, as when we hear about earthquakes and great suffering of war and what have you, we want to give relief work. But then many of us want to keep giving relief work. What people need is community development. They need to be empowered to build their own community. And they may need some help with that. But we need to work on these partnerships. And getting back to this idea of the long-term Church of the Brethren partnerships in South Sudan, that's what we have. And, we don't have any churches there. We're not over there trying to evangelize and make everybody like us. We are just working with partners that has been over many years. Now, the South Sudan Council of Churches, which is its name today, the Council of Churches in the Republic of South Sudan, has people who are previous partners. One of those people works with the Africa Inland Church. He's a pastor in the Africa Inland Church in Torit. And he is also the Brethren liaison for South Sudan. And his name is Athanasus Ungang. Athanasus is a man about 53 who was himself a refugee at one point. He was working with the South Sudan Council, or with the New Sudan Council of Churches during the time of war in the 90s, because of his brethren friendships and all. And one of the things he's done just outside of Torit is that he has started the Brethren Peace Center, which eventually will be a place where people can come for trauma healing ministry, because everybody in South Sudan has been touched by trauma of some kind related to war and what have you. And he also wants to do work with transporting medicines to outlying clinics in the area. He's got some real dreams. And he's calling this the Brethren Peace Center in honor of the Church of the Brethren. We are helping him fulfill his dream and the dreams of others there. He works very closely with a man named Tito Eranga, who is a regional bishop of the Africa Inland Church, and another man named Romano, who runs an orphanage just up the road that serves children who have been traumatized by war, both in the current struggles in the north of South Sudan and also from Uganda. You may have heard of a very extremist Christian movement in Uganda over the past years called the Lord's Army, where they were doing horrible things. And there are children who saw their families murdered and stuff from Uganda who are in South Sudan at this orphanage. So there's wonderful peace work kinds of things happening. There's a school being built at Lohila where a woman of the community spoke to us about their effort to build a school, which we are partners in, Church of the Brethren, and the Peace Center. Our Global Missions and Service Office in Elgin, Illinois, is working closely with these efforts of Athanasus there at the Peace Center and in helping get the school in Lohila built. One other man I want to tell you about, two other men. One is the Bishop of the Africa Inland Church, Bishop Arcangelo Wani, and he works closely with the Sudan Council of Churches in South Sudan. And he has also partnered with Bishop Paridi Taban, the Bishop Emeritus of Torit. He's retired bishop of the Catholic Church in Torit, who I met in '93, an incredible guy, kind of the Bishop Tutu of South Sudan, committed to nonviolence, very brave,
He's still alive and well.
alive and well. And these two men and the South Sudan Council of Churches and partners who are Muslim faith leaders working closely with the South Sudan Council of Churches in the peace talks in Addis Ababa, trying to keep the war from expanding in South Sudan. This is the kind of peacemaking stuff going on. It's just amazing, interfaith and interdenominational cooperation with indigenous religious people too, people who we call traditionals, the traditional faith kind of oriented folk of South Sudan. There's a lot of this kind of peacemaking that we don't hear about here in the United States.
We don't hear anything.
Bishop Torit has a community named Quran, near the town of Quran, which is an international peace community, and they are Muslim, Christian, traditionals, and about 17 different tribal ethnicities, including Dinka and Nuer, which have historical animosities, and other tribal groupings of South Sudan, living in peace together, intentionally, an intentional community, to prove to the world that this can be done in South Sudan.
Wonderful.
That to me is a miracle. That to me is the story of Philip telling his friend Nathaniel, you got to come see this guy.
Wow.
You got to come see this guy. Isn't he from Nazareth? What good can come out of Nazareth?
Yeah.
You got to see him. And that's what I think I saw in South Sudan. I saw this guy.
Yeah.
He's alive and well.
John, thank you for being with us and sharing just even a little bit of your adventures in the South Sudan.
Well, my pleasure, Brent. And if anybody, I'll come to anybody's home, I'll come to anybody's church, I'll come to anybody's synagogue, I'll come to anybody's mosque, I'll come to anybody's whatever to talk about my brothers and sisters in the South Sudan, in the Republic of South Sudan. And I thank you for your time and for this message going out to so many. I thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you.
For Brethren Voices, this is Brent Carlson,
And John Jones,
wishing you peace.
peace be with you.
All those who tread
All those who tread
the path he trod,
the path he trod.
all those who tread
All those who tread
the path he trod,
the path he trod.
all those who tread the path he trod shall be called the friends of God. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin